She stood at the podium, 7 months pregnant, in labor, facing 300 elite guests and the husband who had destroyed her life. He thought she would read the speech he wrote. He thought she would smile and lie like a good wife. He thought wrong. What Vivian did next brought a billionaire to his knees, sent his mistress running, and made headlines across the country. But here is the twist. She almost gave up. She almost let him win. If you want to know how one woman turned her darkest moment into the ultimate revenge, stay until the end. Trust me, the ending will leave you breathless. Drop a comment telling me what you would do in her place. The crystal chandeliers of the Ashford Foundation ballroom cast diamonds of light across 300 faces. Every seat was filled, every champagne flute was raised, and every eye was fixed on the woman standing at the podium, her voice trembling as it echoed through the grand space. Vivian Holloway gripped the edges of the lectern, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Behind her, a massive projection screen hummed with dormant potential. In front of her, seated at the head table with a confident smile, sat her husband, Garrett Ashford. His tuxedo was immaculate. His posture was relaxed. He had no idea what was coming. "My husband asked me to give a toast tonight," Vivian said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "So I will. I will toast to the man he really is." Her finger hovered over the remote control hidden in her palm. Garrett's smile flickered, just slightly. She pressed the button. The screen behind her blazed to life. 72 hours earlier. None of this had been imaginable. 72 hours earlier, Vivian Holloway had been nothing more than a tired pregnant woman who believed in her marriage. The emergency room at Manhattan General Hospital never truly slept. At 5:30 in the morning, the fluorescent lights still buzzed with that same persistent hum they had maintained for the past 14 hours. Vivian peeled off her surgical gloves and dropped them into the waste bin, her shoulders aching from a shift that had included 2 cardiac arrests, 1 gunshot wound, and a teenager who had overdosed in her mother's arms. She was exhausted, but beneath the exhaustion, something warmer glowed. She pressed her hand against the swell of her belly, feeling the gentle movement within. 7 months along, after 3 years of trying, after 2 miscarriages that had nearly broken her, this baby was her miracle. "You look like you could sleep for a week," said Margot Bellamy, appearing beside her with 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee. Margot was 53, had been a nurse for longer than Vivian had been alive, and possessed the rare gift of making everyone around her feel seen. Vivian accepted the coffee gratefully. "I feel like I could sleep for a month." "Go home. Rest. That baby needs you horizontal." Vivian smiled and pulled out her phone, typing a quick message to Garrett. "Coming home. Cannot wait to see you." She added a heart emoji, then deleted it, then added it again. They had been married for 4 years, but lately something had shifted between them, a distance she could not quite name. She told herself it was the pregnancy, the stress, the long hours they both worked. She told herself a lot of things. The message remained unread as she gathered her belongings. She checked his location on the family sharing app they had set up years ago, a habit born from the early days of their relationship when he would surprise her at the hospital with flowers. The dot that represented her husband blinked from a location she did not recognize immediately, the Plaza Hotel. She stared at the screen for a long moment. He must have had a late meeting with investors. He must have been too tired to drive home. There were 100 explanations, and she chose the kindest one because that was what good wives did. The cab ride home took 23 minutes. Manhattan was still quiet at this hour, the streets belonging to delivery trucks and early joggers and the occasional taxi ferrying someone home from wherever they had spent their night. Vivian watched the city scroll past her window and thought about the nursery they had been decorating. Soft yellow walls, a mobile of silver stars, a rocking chair where she would sit and feed their daughter in just 8 weeks. Their daughter. She still could not quite believe it. The elevator to the penthouse was silent except for the soft classical music piped through hidden speakers. Garrett had insisted on this building. The marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the address that announced success before anyone spoke a word. Vivian had never felt entirely comfortable here. It was beautiful in the way museum exhibits were beautiful. Untouchable. Cold. The apartment was dark when she entered. She flipped on the hallway light and moved quietly through the space. Not wanting to wake Garrett if he had somehow made it home while her phone was refreshing, but his side of the bed was untouched. The bathroom was empty, His briefcase was not by the door. She stood in the center of their bedroom and felt something cold settle in her chest. Stop it, she told herself. You are tired. You are hormonal. You are imagining things. But she walked to his home office anyway. She would leave him a note on his desk. Something sweet for him to find when he returned. That was all. Just a note. The office door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside, reaching for the lamp on his desk. Her elbow caught a folder perched on the edge, sending it tumbling to the floor. Papers scattered across the carpet. Perfect, she muttered, lowering herself awkwardly to collect them. That was when she saw the receipt from Cartier. $14,000 for a diamond bracelet. Purchased 3 weeks ago. Vivian did not own a diamond bracelet. Her hands began to tremble as she gathered more papers. A reservation confirmation for dinner at Per Se. A date when she had been working a double shift. A second reservation. A third. All at restaurants she had never visited. On nights she had been alone. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a photograph. Vivian's breath stopped. The image showed Garrett on what appeared to be a yacht. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He was smiling. That private smile she had once believed was reserved only for her. And pressed against him, her arms wrapped around his neck, was a woman Vivian recognized instantly. Piper Sinclair, Garrett's executive assistant. The woman who had brought flowers to her baby shower. The woman who had hugged her and said, "You are so lucky to have him." Vivian sank to the floor of her husband's office. She pressed her hand against her pregnant belly as if she could shield her daughter from this moment. And she cried, silently, desperately. The kind of crying that comes when your entire world collapses and no one is there to catch you. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the sun to begin rising through the windows. Long enough for her tears to dry and her breath to steady. Long enough to hear the front door open and close. Footsteps approached. Expensive shoes on marble floors. Garrett appeared in the doorway of his office. Still wearing last night's clothes, his shirt was wrinkled. His collar was smudged with something that might have been lipstick. And clinging to him like a second skin was the unmistakable scent of perfume. Something floral. Something that was not hers. He saw her on the floor. He saw the photograph in her hand. And for just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, not shame, annoyance. "You went through my things," he said. Vivian rose slowly from the floor, her pregnant body protesting every movement. She held the photograph in front of her like evidence at a trial, which in many ways it was. How long? Her voice was steadier than she expected. Garrett sighed the sigh of a man inconvenienced. He walked past her to his desk, removing his cufflinks and setting them in their designated tray. Everything about him was controlled, measured, irritatingly calm. "I asked you a question." Vivian's voice rose despite her efforts to contain it. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" He turned to face her then, and she saw something in his eyes she had never noticed before. A coldness, a calculation, as if he were assessing her the way he assessed failing investments. 2 years, he said, give or take. 2 years. The words hit her like a physical blow. 2 years ago, she had been recovering from her second miscarriage. 2 years ago, he had held her while she sobbed and promised they would try again. 2 years ago, while she was bleeding and broken, he was already in another woman's bed. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. She hated how small she sounded, how desperate. Garrett laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Why, look at you, Vivian. When was the last time you had energy for anything besides that hospital? When was the last time you looked at me the way Piper does?" "I was grieving," she whispered. "I was grieving our children. And I was living?" He straightened his collar, checking his reflection in the window. "Piper understands that. Piper does not come home exhausted and fall asleep before dinner. Piper makes me feel like a man." Vivian felt something inside her cracking. Not breaking, not yet, but developing fractures that would eventually give way. "Does everyone know, does your mother know?" The smirk that crossed his face before his words did. "My mother has known for a year. She agrees that Piper is better suited to the Ashford lifestyle, but she also understands the value of appearances." He gestured vaguely toward Vivian's belly. "The baby helps. A child born in wedlock. A picture-perfect family for the charity galas. We can make this work. Make this work, Vivian repeated incredulously. You want me to stay married to you while you continue your affair? I want you to be reasonable. He stepped closer, and for the first time, she noticed how much taller he was, how much stronger. You signed a prenuptial agreement. Vivian, if you leave, you walk away with nothing. No money, no property. And do you really think any judge is going to give full custody to an ER nurse who works 80-hour weeks over a wealthy businessman with flexible hours and a stable home? Her blood ran cold. You would not. I would do whatever is necessary to protect my interests. His voice was perfectly pleasant, as if they were discussing the weather. And right now, my interests include keeping this marriage intact, at least publicly. Vivian backed away from him until she hit the wall. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, protecting the child within from a father who saw her as nothing more than a strategic asset. I need to think, she managed. Take your time. Garrett moved toward the door. I'm going to shower. We have brunch with the Carlstons at 11. Wear something that covers those circles under your eyes. He left her standing in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The call to Margot lasted 43 minutes. Vivian sat on the bathroom floor with the door locked, speaking in whispered fragments between sobs. Margot listened without interruption, and when Vivian finally fell silent, her response was immediate. I am coming over. He will see you. He will know I told someone. I do not care what he knows. You should not be alone right now. But Margot did not arrive alone. She came with coffee and pastries and a small recording device she had purchased at an electronics store on her way over. If he threatens you again, you document it, Margot said firmly, pressing the device into Vivian's palm. You are not powerless here. Viv, you just need to be smart. For a few hours, Vivian almost believed it. Almost believed that with Margot's support, she could navigate this nightmare. Almost believed that somewhere, somehow, there was a way out that did not end with her losing everything. Then Garrett returned from his brunch with news. We have visitors, he announced from the doorway of the bedroom where Vivian was pretending to rest. She followed him to the living room and found two men waiting. The first she recognized as Preston Holt, the Ashford family attorney. He had been at their wedding, had shaken her hand and called her a lovely addition to the family. The second man was younger, sharper, with the look of someone who had never lost a negotiation in his life. What is this? Vivian asked. Preston stepped forward with a leather folder. Mrs. Ashford, I have been asked to present you with a post-nuptial agreement. Given recent developments in your marriage, Mr. Ashford and his family feel it is prudent to clarify certain terms. Vivian's stomach dropped. Recent developments? You mean his affair? I mean various circumstances that have come to light. Preston's voice was professionally neutral. This agreement modifies the original prenuptial to address custody arrangements should the marriage dissolve. He opened the folder and placed the document on the coffee table. Vivian scanned it, her legal knowledge limited but sufficient to understand the core terms. If she ever publicly discussed Garrett's infidelity, she would forfeit all custody rights to their child. If she attempted to leave the marriage without his consent, she would forfeit all custody rights. If she did anything to damage his reputation or business interests, she would forfeit all custody rights. This is insane, she breathed. This would never hold up in court. The younger lawyer spoke for the first time. Mrs. Ashford, I am Richard Sullivan, and I specialize in family law. I can assure you that properly drafted post-nuptial agreements are routinely upheld, especially when both parties sign voluntarily. Voluntarily, Vivian laughed, though there was no humor in it. You call this voluntary? Garrett sat down across from her, his posture relaxed, his expression patient in the way of someone who knows they have already won. Vivian, I need you to understand your position. You have no money of your own. Your mother is gone. You have no family to turn to. And I have 3 doctors willing to testify that pregnancy has made you emotionally unstable. The room tilted. You would have me committed. I would do what is necessary. He leaned forward. Sign the document. Be a good wife. Have the baby. Attend the parties. And we can all be very comfortable for a very long time. Vivian looked at the papers. Looked at Garrett. Looked at Preston Holt, who would not meet her eyes, and Richard Sullivan, who watched her with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. She thought of her daughter, growing inside her, depending on her for everything. And with shaking hands, she signed. The next morning, Vivian tried to convince herself that everything would be fine. She went through the motions of her morning routine, showering, dressing, eating a breakfast she could not taste. Garrett had left early for the office, kissing her cheek as if the previous day had never happened. "Wear the blue dress to the Henderson dinner tonight," he had said. "It hides how tired you look." She waited until his car pulled away from the building before she allowed herself to breathe. Then she grabbed her purse and headed for the hospital. She needed to work. She needed to feel useful. She needed to be anywhere but in that suffocating penthouse. The feeling of being watched began halfway to the subway station. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. The lack of sleep, the stress, the hormones that made everything feel heightened and overwhelming. But when she paused at a crosswalk and glanced over her shoulder, she saw him, a man in a dark jacket, standing too still, watching her with the focused attention of someone being paid to do exactly that. She walked faster. He kept pace. She ducked into a coffee shop and watched through the window. He positioned himself across the street, pretending to look at his phone, but his eyes never left the entrance. Garrett had hired someone to follow her. The realization should have frightened her, and it did. But beneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like clarity. Because if Garrett felt the need to have her followed, that meant he was scared of what she might do. And if he was scared, that meant she still had some power he had not managed to take away. She pulled out her phone and tried to access the joint checking account where her paychecks were deposited. The app loaded, requested her password, and then displayed a message she had never seen before. "Account access restricted. Please contact your financial institution." Her fingers trembled as she dialed the bank's customer service number. After 20 minutes on hold, a sympathetic representative informed her that her access had been frozen at the request of the primary account holder. "But I am also an account holder," Vivian said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My salary is deposited into that account." "I understand, ma'am, but the account was originally opened in your husband's name. Without his authorization, I cannot make any changes." She hung up without saying goodbye. No money, no freedom, no way to plan or prepare or escape. Vivian sat in that coffee shop for over an hour, watching her stalker watch her, feeling the walls of her prison grow taller with every passing minute. She thought about calling Margot, but what could Margot do? She thought about going to the police, but what crime had been committed? A husband freezing his own bank account, a security consultant following his client's wife. She thought about her mother, dead 2 years now from the cancer that had taken her slowly and painfully. Her mother, who had raised her alone after her father left, who had worked double shifts at a factory to put Vivian through nursing school, who had held her hand at the end and whispered, "You are stronger than you know, baby girl. Do not ever let anyone make you forget that." The memory brought tears to her eyes, but it also brought something else, a spark of the determination her mother had modeled her entire life. "I will not let him win," Vivian thought. "I do not know how yet, but I will not let him win." She left the coffee shop through a back entrance she discovered led to an alley connecting to the next street. The man in the dark jacket did not see her go. It was a small victory, but she clung to it. At the hospital, she discovered that she could not even find refuge in her work. Her supervisor called her into the office before she had finished putting her belongings in her locker. "Vivian, please sit down." She sat. "I received a call this morning from a Dr. Robert Matthews. He claimed to be your psychiatrist." The blood drained from Vivian's face. "I do not have a psychiatrist." Her supervisor's expression was carefully neutral. "He expressed concerns about your mental stability, said you had been exhibiting signs of severe anxiety and possible delusions. He recommended that you be placed on administrative leave until you could be properly evaluated." "That is a lie." Vivian's voice cracked. "I have never met any Robert Matthews. Someone is trying to destroy my career." "I believe you." Her supervisor leaned forward. "But the hospital board does not care what I believe. They received a formal complaint, and they have to take it seriously. You are being placed on paid leave effective immediately pending a psychiatric evaluation." "This cannot be happening. I fought for you." "Vivian, I told them, you are one of the best nurses I have ever worked with, but the Ashford name carries weight in this city, and someone with that name very much wants you out of this building. Vivian walked out of the hospital in a daze. Her badge had been collected. Her locker had been emptied. Everything she had worked for since nursing school was now held hostage by a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. She sat on a bench outside the emergency room entrance and watched ambulances come and go. This was where she had saved lives. This was where she had found purpose. And now she was not even allowed inside. Her phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. I heard about your leave. So sorry, darling. This must be so hard for you. Come home and rest. She stared at the message until her vision blurred. Another text followed. By the way, I spoke with that lawyer you met yesterday. Margaret Foster. Lovely woman. She was very helpful. Vivian's heart stopped. She had not told Garrett about meeting with Margaret Foster. The meeting had been arranged through Margot's cousin, a completely independent connection that should have been impossible for Garrett to trace. But he knew, somehow. He knew. Her phone buzzed one more time. There is nowhere you can go that I will not find you. There is no one you can trust that I cannot buy. Come home, Vivian. Accept your place. She sat on that bench as the sun moved across the sky, watching her life crumble piece by piece. No job, no money, no allies, no escape. When she finally stood, her legs were numb, and her face was streaked with tears she did not remember crying. She walked to the edge of the sidewalk and stood there for a long moment, watching the traffic blur past. Then her daughter kicked, a small, insistent movement against her palm, a reminder that she was not fighting just for herself anymore. I will find a way, she promised silently. I do not know how, but I will find a way. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the penthouse. But as the city scrolled past her window, something inside her was already changing, already hardening, already beginning to plan. 3 days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Vivian attended dinners, smiled for photographs, stood beside Garrett at charity events while he accepted handshakes and congratulations, playing the role of devoted wife while her soul screamed in protest. But something had shifted inside her. The desperation was still there, but it had been joined by something colder, something patient, something that watched and waited and planned. On the 4th day, a memory surfaced. She was in the penthouse, pretending to nap while Garrett took a conference call in his office when she remembered the documents. Last year, he had needed her signature on a stack of papers for what he called a simple tax restructuring. She had signed without reading, trusting him, loving him, believing that marriage meant partnership. What if it had meant something else entirely? She waited until Garrett left for a lunch meeting before making her move. The building employed a rotating staff of notaries to service the wealthy residents who frequently needed documents authenticated. Vivian had met one of them several times, a kind older woman named Dorothy Whitmore, who always asked about her pregnancy with genuine interest. She found Dorothy in the building's business center, sorting through files with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing the same job for decades. Mrs. Ashford, Dorothy said warmly, how are you feeling? Not long now. Is it 8 weeks? Vivian managed to smile. Dorothy, I need to ask you about something. It is a bit delicate. The older woman's expression shifted to concern. Of course. What is it? Last year, you notarized some documents for my husband, financial papers that required my signature. Do you remember? Dorothy's face changed? The warmth faded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. I remember. What do you remember? Specifically? The older woman glanced around the empty business center, then lowered her voice. Mrs. Ashford, I should not be telling you this. I could lose my position. Please, Oi. Vivian reached out and took her hand. I need to know the truth. Dorothy was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I told your husband that I should not notarize those documents. The signatures were made outside my presence. That is against regulation. But he insisted. He said you were too busy to come down, that you had already signed everything upstairs. Vivian's pulse quickened. Are you saying my signature was forged? I am saying that I never witnessed you signing anything. And when I raised concerns, your husband's lawyer, that Preston Holt, He reminded me that I have a pension with this building's management company. He reminded me that pensions can be complicated. The implication was clear. Dorothy had been threatened into silence. "What did those documents do?" Vivian asked. "What did I supposedly sign?" Dorothy shook her head. "I do not know the details, but I remember the heading on one of them, something about liability transfer for the Ashford Group construction projects." Liability transfer. Vivian's legal knowledge was limited, but even she understood what that might mean. If Garrett's company had done something wrong, something illegal, those forged documents could make her responsible for it. She thanked Dorothy and walked away with her mind racing. She had been right. Garrett had not just betrayed her emotionally. He had set her up to take the fall for something she did not even understand. That night, she lay awake while Garrett snored beside her, and she formulated a plan. The prenuptial agreement might be airtight. The postnuptial agreement might be terrifying, but forged signatures were a different matter entirely. If she could prove that Garrett had committed fraud using her name, both agreements would be void. She would be free. She just needed evidence. Over the following days, Vivian became a ghost in her own home. She smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but her eyes were always watching, her ears were always listening. And late at night, when Garrett was asleep or away, she searched. His home office yielded nothing. He had become more careful since she found the photograph, but she remembered something he had mentioned months ago, bragging about his own cleverness. He kept backups of everything on an old phone, disconnected from the cloud, stored in his desk at work where no one could access it but him. She needed to get into his office at the Ashford Group headquarters. "I want to surprise Garrett with lunch tomorrow," she told his secretary, calling from a phone Margot had given her. "It has been so hard for him lately with all the stress of the new developments. I thought I would bring his favorite sandwich and maybe tidy up his desk a bit. He hates when it gets cluttered." The secretary, who had no reason to suspect anything, was delighted to help. "How sweet, Mrs. Ashford. I will make sure the office is empty around noon. He has meetings on the 12th floor all afternoon." The next day, Vivian walked into the Ashford Group building with a sandwich she had no intention of delivering. She smiled at security, chatted with the receptionist, played the role of doting wife so perfectly that no one questioned her presence. Inside Garrett's corner office, she found the phone exactly where she remembered him describing it, in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, beneath a false panel, wrapped in an old sweater. Her hands shook as she powered it on. The contents made her stomach turn. Hundreds of text messages between Garrett and Piper, spanning years. Photographs she wished she had never seen, but also something else, something that changed in everything. Audio recordings. Garrett, it seemed, had a habit of recording his phone conversations, perhaps for leverage, perhaps out of paranoia. Whatever the reason, the evidence was damning. One recording featured him instructing a contractor to use substandard materials on a residential building. Another captured him threatening a city inspector who had discovered the violation. But the recording that stopped Vivian's heart entirely was dated just 2 weeks ago. Garrett's voice. "The pregnancy is becoming inconvenient. She is asking too many questions, noticing too much." Piper's voice. "What are you going to do?" A pause, then Garrett. "If she loses the baby from stress, even better. One less complication." Vivian pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. This man, her husband, the father of her child, had spoken about their daughter's death as if it were nothing more than a business advantage. She copied every file to a flash drive she had hidden in her bra. Then she replaced the phone exactly as she had found it, walked out of the building with a smile, and made it 2 blocks before she had to duck into an alley to vomit. But when she straightened up and wiped her mouth, her eyes were dry, her jaw was set, and her plan had crystallized into something sharp and unbreakable. The Ashford Foundation Gala was in 5 days. Garrett was receiving their annual Family Man of the Year award. He had asked her to give the introductory speech. She would give them a speech they would never forget. For 3 days. Vivian moved through her life with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. She smiled at Garrett over breakfast. She attended a baby shower that Eleanor had organized, accepting gifts and well wishes from women who had no idea their hostess had known about the affair for a year. She even accompanied Piper Sinclair on a trip to select flowers for the gala. sitting across from her husband's mistress and discussing color palettes as if they were simply two professionals doing their jobs. And every night, after Garrett fell asleep, she worked on her presentation. She organized the evidence chronologically. She created backup copies on 3 different cloud servers, each under a fake email address she had established using the library computers downtown. She wrote and rewrote her speech until every word carried the weight she intended. On the 4th day, she allowed herself a small celebration. She met Margot at a cafe far from the Upper East Side, in a neighborhood where no one would recognize her, and she told her best friend everything. "You did it," Margot breathed, tears streaming down her face. "You actually did it." "Not yet." But Vivian smiled for the first time in weeks. "Not until the gala. But yes, I think I actually have a chance." "What about the forged documents?" "The liability transfer. I have copies of Garrett instructing his lawyer to prepare them, and I found the originals in a safe in his office. The signature on them does not match my actual signature. Any handwriting expert would confirm they are forgeries." Margot grabbed her hand across the table. "Vivian, this is huge. This does not just get you out of the marriage. This could send him to prison." "I know." And for one glorious moment, Vivian allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was almost over, that in just 48 hours, she would stand in front of 300 people and expose her husband for the monster he truly was. She should have known better. That evening, Vivian returned to the penthouse to find Garrett waiting in the living room. He was not alone. Eleanor sat in the armchair by the window, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression frozen in that aristocratic disapproval she had perfected over 7 decades of judging everyone around her. "Darling," Garrett said, rising to kiss her cheek, "we need to talk." The familiar dread settled into Vivian's stomach. "About what?" Eleanor answered before Garrett could speak. "About your little research project, dear." The world stopped. "I do not know what you mean," Vivian managed, but her voice betrayed her. Garrett walked to the bar and poured himself a drink. "Did you really think I would not have security cameras in my own office? I watched you. Vivian, I watched you search my desk. I watched you find the phone. I watched you copy the files." "No, no, no, no." "You should see your face right now," Leonor said with a thin smile. "You look like a child caught stealing cookies. Did you honestly believe you were clever enough to outmaneuver my son?" Vivian's legs would not hold her. She sank onto the sofa, her hand instinctively covering her belly, as if she could protect her daughter from what was coming. Garrett sat down beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "The files you copied have already been deleted from every cloud server you created. Our IT team is very thorough, and the flash drive you hid in your underwear drawer gone." Everything she had worked for, everything she had risked, gone. "But that is not the worst part," Eleanor continued, and her voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a killing blow. "The worst part is what we have prepared in return." Preston Holt entered from the hallway, carrying a tablet. He set it on the coffee table in front of Vivian and pressed play. The video that appeared showed a woman who looked exactly like Vivian sitting in a hospital room, speaking to someone off camera. "I knew about the affair," the fake Vivian said. "I just did not care enough to stop it. The money was too good." "And the construction violations," a voice asked from off camera. "I helped cover them up. The documents were my idea." Vivian stared at the screen in horror. The woman in the video wore her face, moved with her mannerisms, spoke with her voice, but the words were lies. Every single one of them. "Deepfake technology has come so far," Garrett said conversationally. "This was created using footage from our security cameras and voice samples from your phone calls. Our experts assure me it would take months for any analyst to prove it is fabricated." "You cannot do this," Vivian whispered. "I can do anything I want." Garrett's voice hardened. "And here is what is going to happen. You are going to attend the gala in 2 days. You are going to give a beautiful speech about what a wonderful husband I am. You are going to smile for the cameras and play your part perfectly. And in exchange, this video will never see the light of day." "And if I refuse," Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt with manicured hands. "If you refuse, this video goes to every news outlet in the country. Your nursing license, which is already suspended, will be permanently revoked. You will be named as a co-conspirator in your husband's construction fraud. And when the custody battle begins, you will be portrayed as an unstable criminal who tried to frame her husband to steal his money. Vivian looked between them, searching for any crack in their armor. There was none. I thought you might need time to consider, Garrett said, finishing his drink. So I will give you until tomorrow evening to think it over. But I should warn you, the speech has already been written. All you have to do is read it. They left her alone in the living room as the sun set over Manhattan. Vivian sat in the gathering darkness, her dreams of freedom crumbling around her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to feel completely and utterly hopeless. She had been so close, so impossibly close, and now she had nothing. Vivian did not sleep that night. She sat in the nursery they had been preparing, surrounded by the soft yellow walls and the Silver Star Mobile, and she let herself feel every ounce of the despair that had been building for weeks. She had failed. She had tried to fight back, and she had failed spectacularly. Garrett had won. He had always been going to win. She was nothing but a nurse from nowhere, and he was a man who owned half of Manhattan. Around 3 in the morning, she found herself standing at the window of the penthouse, looking down at the street 30 floors below. The thought that crossed her mind was not something she was proud of, but it was there, undeniable and terrifying. And then her daughter kicked. Not a gentle flutter this time, but a strong, insistent movement that seemed to say, I am here. I am counting on you. Do not give up. Vivian pressed both hands against her belly and wept. She wept for herself, for her daughter, for the life she had imagined and the life she had gotten instead. She wept until she had nothing left. And then, in the stillness that followed, she remembered her mother's voice. When they think you have been beaten, that is when you hit back. Something changed in that moment. The despair did not disappear, but it transformed. It hardened into something else entirely, something that felt almost like steel. She sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and began to think. Garrett had destroyed her cloud backups. He had taken her flash drive. He had security footage of her finding the evidence. He held all the cards. Or did he? She closed her eyes and replayed everything she had heard and seen over the past weeks. The recordings, the photographs, the forged documents, the deep-fake video, and then she remembered something small, something Garrett had said during one of his bragging sessions, the way he always bragged when he thought he was untouchable. The beauty of digital evidence, and he had said, is that it can be copied infinite times without degradation. That is why I keep everything backed up locally. Never trust the cloud. Backed up locally. Vivian's eyes snapped open. If Garrett kept backups of everything, that meant he had a backup of the recordings on that phone. And if he was as paranoid as she suspected, he would keep those backups somewhere accessible in case of emergency, somewhere he could reach them quickly if he needed leverage. Not the office. That was too far away, not the penthouse. He would never keep evidence of his crimes where she could find it. His car. Garrett drove a custom Mercedes with a built-in safe in the trunk. He had shown it to her once, years ago, proud of the security features. A biometric lock that responded only to his fingerprint. But Vivian was a nurse. She knew things about biometrics that Garrett did not. The next morning, she made breakfast as if nothing had happened. She kissed Garrett goodbye as he left for work. She waved to the security guard who was obviously still following her every move. Then she went to work herself. At a pharmacy far from their neighborhood, she purchased a small container of liquid silicone and a specialized adhesive used for prosthetic applications. At a hardware store, she bought a heat gun and several sheets of thin latex. At a beauty supply shop, she acquired sculpting tools designed for special effects makeup. Back at the penthouse, she retrieved something she had saved from a birthday party months ago. A champagne glass Garrett had used, still bearing the faint impression of his fingers. The process took 7 hours. Vivian worked with the precision that made her an excellent nurse, lifting the fingerprint from the glass, creating a mold, casting a thin silicone replica, and testing it on her own phone until she was certain it would work. By evening, she had what she needed. Garrett returned home late, already dressed for a pre-gala dinner with donors. He barely glanced at her as he grabbed his keys from the hall table. Remember, he said, tomorrow is the big day. I expect perfection. You will get exactly what you deserve, Vivian replied. He smiled, mistaking her words for compliance. That is my girl. She waited until his car pulled away from the building. Then she moved. The parking garage was monitored by security cameras, but Vivian had studied their rotation for weeks. There was a 90-second window when the camera covering Garrett's parking space panned to the far end of the garage. She timed her approach perfectly. The trunk safe opened on the second try. Inside, she found exactly what she had hoped for. A second phone, identical to the one in his office. Multiple flash drives labeled by year, printed copies of documents bearing her forged signature, and something she had not expected at all. A file folder containing photographs of Piper Sinclair. Not romantic photographs. These showed Piper meeting with men Vivian did not recognize, exchanging envelopes, entering buildings that looked decidedly corporate. There was a handwritten note attached. Insurance policy. Piper thinks she has leverage, but I have more. Garrett had been documenting Piper's activities. He was planning to betray his mistress the same way he had betrayed his wife. Vivian photographed everything. She copied the audio files to a new flash drive she had purchased with cash. She returned the items exactly as she had found them and closed the safe. The camera panned back to its original position just as she stepped into the elevator. Tomorrow night was the gala. Tomorrow night, she would have her revenge. The morning of the gala dawned gray and cold, a November sky that seemed to mirror the gravity of what Vivian was about to attempt. She stood at the penthouse window and watched the city wake up, her hand resting on her belly, her mind running through every detail of her plan. In 12 hours, she would either be free or destroyed. There was no middle ground anymore. Garrett was unusually attentive throughout the day, which made everything harder. He brought her tea in bed. He complimented her appearance. He even talked about the baby with something that almost resembled genuine excitement. I have been thinking about names, he said over lunch. Victoria for a girl. Perhaps Victoria Ashford. It sounds powerful. Vivian nodded and smiled and hated herself for how easy it was to pretend. Eleanor arrived in the afternoon to supervise the final preparations. She swept through the penthouse like a general inspecting troops, adjusting flowers, critiquing the caterer's choices, reminding Vivian exactly how important this evening was for the Ashford legacy. The mayor will be there, Eleanor said, examining Vivian's gown with a critical eye, as will 3 senators and the entire board of the Metropolitan Opera. This is not an occasion for mistakes. I understand, Vivian replied. Do you? Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Because I want to be absolutely clear about what happens if you embarrass my son tonight. That video we discussed goes public within the hour. Your child will be taken from you before she draws her first breath, and you will spend the rest of your life knowing that you could have prevented all of it. Vivian met her mother-in-law's eyes without flinching. I said I understand. Eleanor nodded, apparently satisfied, and swept out to terrorize the event coordinators. The hours crawled past. Vivian retreated to the bathroom to do her makeup, using the privacy to review her presentation one final time on the burner phone Margot had given her. Everything was uploaded to a new server using a VPN. Everything was ready. At 6 o'clock, she began to dress. The gown Eleanor had selected was emerald green, designed to accommodate her pregnant figure while still projecting elegance. Vivian slipped into it and stared at her reflection. This is it, she thought. This is the moment you have been waiting for. But her body had other plans. At 6:30, she felt the first contraction. She froze, one hand gripping the bathroom counter, the other pressed against her belly. No, not now, not tonight. Please, not tonight. The pain passed, and she convinced herself it was nothing. Braxton Hicks, false labor. Stress manifesting physically. Then another contraction hit, stronger than the first. And another. By 7 o'clock, she could no longer deny what was happening. Her water had not broken yet, but the contractions were coming every 8 minutes. Her body was going into labor 6 weeks early. She stood in the bathroom of the penthouse, gripping the sink, tears streaming down her face, and faced an impossible choice. Go to the hospital and abandon everything she had worked for, or attend the gala and risk her daughter's life. Vivian, Garrett's voice came through the door. The car is waiting. We need to leave. She closed her eyes and made her decision. I will be right there. The drive to the Ashford Foundation venue felt endless. Every bump in the road triggered another wave of pain. Vivian breathed through each contraction, using the techniques she had learned in prenatal classes, keeping her face composed while her body screamed. Garrett noticed nothing. He was too busy reviewing notes for his acceptance speech, practicing the humble smile he would wear when they presented him with the Family Man of the Year award. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked once, glancing at her briefly. "You look pale." "Just nervous about the speech," she managed. He patted her hand condescendingly. "You will be fine. Just read what is written." They arrived at the venue at 8 o'clock. The ballroom was already filling with guests, a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, champagne flutes, and false smiles. Vivian moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on her pregnancy, counting the minutes between contractions, 7 minutes, 6, 5. The speeches were scheduled for 9 o'clock. She just had to hold on for one more hour. At 8:45, Eleanor took the podium to welcome the guests. At 8:50, a board member presented a retrospective on the foundation's charitable work. At 8:55, Eleanor returned to introduce the main event. "And now," Eleanor announced, "I would like to invite someone very special to say a few words about our honoree. Please welcome my daughter-in-law, Vivian Ashford." Vivian rose from her seat, and another contraction hit so hard she nearly doubled over. She gripped the table edge, breathed through it, and forced herself to walk toward the podium. 300 people watched her approach. Garrett smiled his confident smile. Eleanor nodded approvingly. And Vivian Holloway, in labor, in pain, and absolutely done with being anyone's victim, stepped up to the microphone. The ballroom stretched before Vivian like a battlefield. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across 300 faces, each one turned toward her with polite expectation. Somewhere in the crowd, cameras were recording. Somewhere, reporters were taking notes. Vivian adjusted the microphone with trembling hands. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the contraction building in her abdomen. "My husband asked me to say a few words about him tonight, to toast the man he truly is." She paused, looking out at the audience, at Eleanor, whose expression was satisfied, at Garrett, who nodded encouragingly, at Piper Sinclair, seated at a table near the back, wearing the diamond bracelet that had been purchased with money from a joint account Vivian could not access. "So I will," Vivian continued. "I will toast to the man he truly is." She reached into the hidden pocket of her gown and produced a small remote. "But first, I think you should meet him for yourselves." The screen behind her flickered to life. The first image was the photograph from the yacht. Garrett and Piper, tangled together, unmistakably intimate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's smile froze. Garrett half rose from his seat. "My husband has been having an affair for 2 years," Vivian said clearly, "with his executive assistant, Piper Sinclair, who is present here tonight." Another contraction hit. She gripped the podium and kept talking. "But infidelity is not a crime. What my husband has done that is criminal includes the following." She clicked to the next slide. Documents appeared on the screen. Her forged signature, highlighted. Expert analysis comparing the forgery to her actual handwriting. "My husband forged my signature on liability transfer documents, attempting to make me responsible for construction violations that have injured 3 workers in the past year." Click. A photograph of the substandard materials, building inspection reports that had been falsified. "He bribed city officials to approve buildings that were not safe for occupation." Click. A recording began to play. Garrett's voice filled the ballroom. "If she loses the baby from stress, even better. One less complication." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but her voice remained strong. "That recording was made 2 weeks ago. My husband was discussing our daughter, the child I am carrying right now, who I am in premature labor with at this very moment." Gasps echoed through the room. Eleanor was on her feet, shouting something Vivian could not hear. Garrett was pushing through the crowd toward the podium. Security guards were converging from all directions. But Vivian was not finished. "I have submitted copies of all this evidence to the Manhattan District Attorney," she said quickly, "to the State Bar Association, to every major news outlet in the country. I have also submitted evidence of my husband's plans to betray his mistress, Miss Sinclair, which she may find interesting." She looked directly at Piper, whose face had gone white. "Check your email, Piper. You will want to see what he was documenting about you." Garrett reached the stage, his face contorted with fury. "Get her out of here. She is insane. This is all fabricated." But the damage was done. Phones were out throughout the ballroom, recording, photographing, already sharing to social media. The reporters in attendance were speaking rapidly into their devices. A contraction ripped through Vivian so intensely that she cried out and nearly collapsed. Jordan caught her, appearing from nowhere, his face tight with concern. "Wait, Jordan." She blinked at him in confusion. "How are you here?" "Margot called me," he said quietly. "She told me everything. I am taking you to the hospital right now." "No." Vivian gripped his arm. "No, I need to finish. I need them to hear." But she could not finish. The pain was too great, and her body had finally reached its limit. She sagged against Jordan as chaos erupted around them. The last thing she saw before she was carried from the ballroom was Garrett being surrounded by security guards and police officers who had somehow materialized from the crowd. The last thing she heard was Eleanor screaming that this was all a misunderstanding. And the last thing she felt, as Jordan rushed her toward a waiting ambulance, was something that almost felt like victory. The delivery room at Manhattan General was chaos and peace simultaneously. Vivian gripped the rails of the hospital bed as another contraction tore through her, surrounded by doctors and nurses who had once been her colleagues. "You are fully dilated," Dr. Catherine Pierce announced. "This baby is coming now." Jordan stood beside her, holding her hand, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. He had been at the gala because Margot had known Vivian might need help. He had been watching from the crowd, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Everything had gone wrong, and everything had gone right. "Push, Vivian," Dr. May Pierce instructed. She pushed with everything she had, screaming through the pain, thinking of her mother and her daughter and the life she was about to build from the ashes of the one that had burned. At 11:47 p.m., Hope Holloway was born. 6 weeks premature, 5 pounds, 2 ounces, with her mother's eyes and a cry that filled the delivery room like a declaration of survival. Vivian held her daughter for the first time and wept. "She is beautiful," Jordan whispered. "She is everything," Vivian replied. Outside the delivery room, the world was exploding. News of the gala had gone viral within minutes. Garrett's photograph was on every news site, accompanied by screenshots of the evidence Vivian had displayed. The hashtag Ashford scandal was trending nationally. But inside that room, none of that mattered. Vivian looked down at her daughter's face and made a silent promise. "You will never know the man your father was. You will only know the mother I am going to become." The days following the gala unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion. Each morning brought new revelations, new arrests, new evidence that the Ashford empire had been built on fraud and intimidation and lies. Garrett was arrested on the second day. The charges included multiple counts of forgery, bribery of public officials, reckless endangerment in connection with the construction violations, and witness intimidation. His bail was set at $5 million, but even after it was paid, he found himself a pariah. Business partners who had once clamored for his attention refused his calls. The board of the Ashford Group voted unanimously to remove him as CEO. Piper Sinclair disappeared before she could be questioned. Rumors suggested she had fled to a country without an extradition treaty, taking with her whatever secrets she had managed to salvage. Eleanor Ashford released a public statement expressing shock and dismay at her son's actions, claiming she had known nothing about any of it. No one believed her, but no charges were filed. She retreated to her Connecticut estate and refused all interview requests. Preston Holt, the family attorney who had helped draft the fraudulent agreements, was disbarred within a month. His testimony in exchange for leniency helped prosecutors build an airtight case against Garrett, and Vivian watched it all from her hospital room, where she had been kept for observation while Hope gained strength in the NICU. "I cannot believe you did it," Margot said, sitting beside her bed on the fourth day. "I mean, I believed you could, but actually watching it happen was something else entirely." Vivian smiled tiredly. "I almost did not. When the contractions started, I almost gave up." "Why did you not?" She thought about it for a long moment. "Because I realized that if I did not speak the truth then, I might never get another chance. And I could not let my daughter grow up in a world where her father controlled everything, including her." Margot squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be proud." The words brought tears to Vivian's eyes. "I hope so." Jordan visited daily, always with coffee and sometimes with small gifts for Hope. Tiny socks and soft blankets purchased from the hospital gift shop. He never pushed for anything, never asked for more than she could give. He simply showed up, again and again, steady and patient. "You do not have to keep coming," Vivian told him once. "You have done enough." He shook his head. "I come because I want to, because I care about you, both of you." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she had not allowed herself to see before. A man who had been waiting in the wings for years, never interfering in her marriage, never overstepping, but always there when she needed him. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much?" Jordan was quiet for a moment. "Because I have watched you for 3 years. Vivian, I have watched you save lives and grieve losses and push through exhaustion that would break most people. I have watched you love a man who did not deserve you and stay loyal to a marriage that was killing you. And through all of it, I have never once seen you lose your kindness or your integrity." He took her hand gently. "That is why I care. Because you're extraordinary. And someone should have told you that a long time ago." Vivian felt something warm bloom in her chest, something she had not felt in years. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the beginning of something that could grow if she let it. "I am not ready," she said honestly. "Not for anything serious, not yet." "I know," he smiled. "I am not going anywhere." Hope was released from the NICU 2 weeks later, healthy and strong despite her early arrival. Vivian carried her daughter out of the hospital and into a world that looked completely different than it had a month ago. She had no penthouse, no joint bank accounts, no husband. What she had was a small apartment in Brooklyn that Margot had helped her find. A settlement from the divorce that would support her and Hope for years. Awarded by a judge who had been thoroughly disgusted by the evidence of fraud. A nursing license that had been reinstated after the accusations against her were proven false. And something else? Something she had not expected. A purpose. The calls had started coming during her hospital stay. Women who had seen the news coverage, who had watched her stand up at that gala and tell the truth. Women who were trapped in their own impossible situations and wanted to know how she had found the strength to escape. She could not answer all of them, but she could answer some. And the more she talked to these women, the more she understood what she was supposed to do next. On Hope's 1-month birthday, Vivian registered a nonprofit organization. She called it the Holloway Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide resources and support for women escaping abusive and controlling relationships. It was small. It was underfunded. It was everything. 6 months after the gala, Vivian stood on the steps of the Manhattan courthouse, watching Garrett of Ashford be led away in handcuffs. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution had presented mountains of evidence, much of it sourced directly from the recordings and documents Vivian had retrieved from his car. Witnesses had testified about bribery, intimidation, and fraud. 3 injured construction workers had described the preventable accidents that had nearly killed them. And through it all, Garrett had maintained his innocence. He had blamed Piper. He had blamed Preston Holt. He had even tried to blame Vivian, claiming she had fabricated the evidence as revenge for discovering his affair. The jury had not believed him. Guilty on all counts. 23 years in federal prison. Vivian felt no joy as she watched him disappear into the prison transport van. No satisfaction, only a profound, exhausted relief that it was finally over. "Mrs. Holloway," a reporter appeared at her elbow, microphone extended. "How do you feel about the verdict?" Vivian considered the question. "I feel grateful that the justice system worked. I feel relieved that my daughter will never have to fear her father. And I feel sad that it came to this at all." "Do you have any regrets?" She thought about that for a long moment, about the marriage she had believed in, about the man she had thought she knew, about the years she had spent making excuses, minimizing warning signs, convincing herself that love meant endurance. "I regret trusting someone who did not deserve my trust," she said finally. "I regret staying silent when I should have spoken up, but I do not regret surviving. I do not regret fighting back, and I do not regret telling the truth." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. "What is next for you?" Vivian smiled. "I am going to pick up my daughter from daycare. I am going to make dinner in my tiny apartment, and I am going to keep building a life that I am proud of, one day at a time." She walked away from the courthouse and into the autumn sunshine. Jordan was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, holding Hope, who was now 7 months old and grabbing enthusiastically at everything within reach. He had been at the trial every day, sitting in the gallery, a quiet presence of support. "How are you doing?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Tired," she admitted. "But okay, really okay." Hope reached toward her mother with chubby arms, and Vivian took her, breathing in the sweet baby smell that had become her favorite thing in the world. "Ice cream," Jordan suggested, to celebrate justice being served. "Ice cream sounds perfect." They walked through the city together, stopping at a small shop in a neighborhood where no one knew or cared about the Ashford scandal. Vivian ordered mint chocolate chip. Jordan got butter pecan. Hope gnawed happily on a teething ring while they sat at a table by the window. "You know," Vivian said between bites, "a year ago, I would never have believed any of this was possible. I was so trapped, so convinced there was no way out." "What changed?" She thought about it. "I stopped trying to be the perfect wife. I stopped making excuses for someone who did not deserve them. And I started believing that I was worth fighting for." Jordan reached across the table and took her hand. "You always were." Their relationship had grown slowly over the past 6 months. No pressure, no rush, just two people getting to know each other without the shadows of her marriage hanging over them. Vivian was not ready to call it love yet, but she was ready to call it something. Hope, maybe, the possibility of happiness. Later that evening, after Hope was asleep in her crib and Jordan had gone home with a gentle kiss goodbye, Vivian sat on her small balcony overlooking the Brooklyn skyline. The city sparkled below her, alive with possibility. She thought about her mother, who had raised her alone and taught her to be strong. She thought about the women who called the Holloway Foundation every day, seeking help, seeking hope. She thought about the speech she had given at the gala, standing in labor, terrified but unbroken. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margot. "Proud of you, always." Vivian smiled and typed back, "Could not have done it without you." She stayed on the balcony for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one above the city lights. She was not the same woman who had walked into that penthouse a year ago, exhausted and naive and desperate to believe in a love that had never existed. She was scarred. She was haunted. She carried memories that would never fully heal. But she was also free. And for the first time in her life, she understood something her mother had tried to tell her years ago. Strength was not the absence of fear or pain or doubt. Strength was choosing to survive anyway. Strength was standing up even when everything inside you screamed to stay down. Vivian Holloway had stood up, and she was never going to bow again. Somewhere across the city, in a prison cell he would occupy for the next 2 decades, Garrett Ashford was learning what it felt like to lose everything. Somewhere else, Eleanor Ashford was discovering that money could not buy back a reputation. And somewhere far away, Piper Sinclair was realizing that the leverage she had counted on was worthless. But Vivian did not think about any of them. Not tonight. Tonight, she thought only of her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, of the life they would build together, of the woman she was becoming. One brave day at a time, the city hummed beneath her. The stars wheeled overhead, and Vivian Holloway, survivor, mother, and warrior, closed her eyes and smiled. She had won.